Okay. Good after. I'm getting the off-camera signal that we are broadcasting live. I hope everyone can hear me. Good afternoon and welcome to our conversation about 2016 trends in legislation. We are at sort of the midpoint of state legislative sessions for the year, and so it's the perfect time to have a conversation about what's been going on out there in the states. And inherently, because we have a new federal education law that was passed and signed back in December, conversations about state policy are now also really intertwined with this new federal policy. So we're going to be talking about the relationship between those things as well. My name is Brennan McMahon Pardon, and I am the Associate Director for State Policy and Advocacy at the Data Quality Campaign. And I am thrilled to be joined by a couple of colleagues for our hangout today. First, I'm glad to welcome Brenda Leong, who is from the Future of Privacy Forum. And I'm also very pleased to welcome, cutely cuddling together in their offices, Claire Voorhees and Jess Langham from the Foundation for Excellence in Education. Thanks to all three of you for joining me and rounding out this conversation about policy. Give me 1 second. I am able to hear myself from your computer. Sorry about that, everyone. So I'm going to start today, first of all, with a warning that we have been having a little bit of internet trouble at the Data Quality Campaign today. So if the webinar suddenly crashes, please check out our event page or Twitter for a new link and accept our apologies. But I'm, knock on wood, hoping that's not going to happen today. And there is also a chat function. If you're joining us from Google Hangout, you can ask questions and we'll try to get to them throughout the webinar. If you have clarifications or want us to talk about something in particular, please throw it up on the chat. I think you're also able to comment on YouTube and follow along on Twitter and tweet questions at us as well. And we will make sure to get those addressed. With that, I'm going to dive right in with some overview of what we've been seeing at DQC in legislation so far. We do track legislation in states across the country, and particularly legislation that has to do with student data privacy. We've really seen a lot of attention to student data privacy from state legislatures over the past 3 years, and this year is no different. So far this year, we have seen 75 student data privacy bills in 27 states. Now, while 75 is still a fairly large quantity for legislation, it demonstrates a significant slowing trend over the past couple of years. I think this time last year we had more than twice that number of bills already. So we're seeing the conversation change. When I say slow down, it's not to say that the importance is diminished, but we're not seeing that flurry of sort of spaghetti to the wall of different types of privacy legislation being introduced across the states. We're also finding, which is exciting, that state legislators are thinking not only about student data privacy, but other ways that they can make data use possible in their states. So we're seeing things, just as a couple of examples, bills that link foster care data with K-12 data, which we'll talk more later. We'll talk more about later in the conversation, building early warning systems, and making sure that data ultimately works for the end user. All really nice trends, and that we think really go hand in hand with the privacy conversation. The really great privacy bills, the stronger bills, I should say, that we're seeing are about fostering use in a secure environment, which is really the right approach. So I just want to give just a little bit more context to just so everybody out there know. Right now, 35 states are in session. A couple of states, Minnesota and Louisiana, I believe, just got started with their legislative session. 9 states, Florida, Indiana, New Mexico, Oregon, Utah, Virginia, Washington, West Virginia, and Wyoming, that is oddly a tongue twister, have already adjourned for the year. So congratulations to advocates out there in those states who might feel like they're able to take a breath at this point, and policymakers who are able to take a breath at this point. And 4 states are not in session at all this year: Montana, Nevada, North Dakota, and Texas. So like I said at the top, inherently, or at least for now, conversations about state policy are somewhat intertwined with conversations about the Every Student Succeeds Act that Congress passed and the president signed in late 2015. A lot of states are starting to already think about what's their role, what are the opportunities under this new federal education law. So when we think about state legislation, we're also thinking about it within this new federal context. So I actually want to turn over to my colleagues just at Excel and Ed briefly. They have prepared a great timeline that helps states think about what are the right policy opportunities, what are the right moments to be thinking about legislation in the context of the SSA. So Claire, just if I could turn it over to you to talk a little bit about that timing.
Absolutely. Yeah, we, as Brennan said, we think the important context for this conversation about ESSA and the state legislation that it has spurred and will spur over the coming years, or spur and inspire and also require over the coming years. It's important to understand this timeline, which is a little bit complicated. Organized, like most things with this large federal bill, is a little complicated. We've organized the timeline by school year. So as you can see, as Brennan mentioned, the bill passed in December 2015. So for the rest of this 2015-16 school year, the U.S. Department of Education is going to be rushing to do rulemaking to implement the law. They're going to speed along as quickly as they can before this administration ends. Their goal is going to be to finish at least their top priorities around assessments and accountabilities before the end of the administration, or by January 2017, which for those of you familiar with how DC and rulemaking works, is actually a breakneck pace. Thinking ahead to the 2016-17 school year, it's going to be another odd year. This is a transition year. The new requirements, the new accountability requirements, and many of the new opportunities under ESSA do not take effect until 2017-18. 2016-17 is just this funny kind of a year. States will still have to test students. They'll still have to report everything, but there aren't going to be any federal accountability requirements tied to any of that. It's going to be really up to the state how they want to handle that transition year in terms of what's happening in its schools. Of course, throughout that year, states will be hard at work trying to figure out what it is they're going to do for the next year when the new requirements take effect. Couple takeaway, in addition to just understanding what happens when, we think there are two key takeaways from this timeline. The first is, in light of the timeline, Congress did give states 18 months to implement this law, and we encourage states to not rush to implement. Congress was actually really thoughtful about this. They gave us an extra school year, and therefore we don't recommend at this point that states rush to make major changes to their accountability systems this legislative session. That's because it's too soon. We don't fully understand the law, in large part because a lot of the gaps need to be filled in by the U.S. Department of Education. The fear is states will rush to change their accountability systems this year, only to find that they have to change them again next year, which is not ideal from a workload or from a vulnerability perspective. You don't want to open up your accountability system all the time. It can lead to a mess. Sure, many of you know. The second thing to emphasize in the timeline is the uncertainty. The next 18 months, while states do have 18 months, they have an enormous amount to do. Many states are still transitioning to new assessments, or they're transitioning to new assessments for the second time in a row. They're unwinding their ESEA waivers. They're figuring out what to do with their accountability system to make it comply with the law. They're setting themselves up for new opportunities. At the same time, there's this thing that I didn't highlight in the timeline, but probably most of us are familiar with, which is the 2016 presidential election. Right in the middle of this whole process, we're going to have a new president and a new Secretary of Education. In fact, states will have their new accountability plans approved by whoever this new person is, this new administration. That's a key factor. We have no idea. Your imaginations couldn't run wild at this point on who that could be and what it would look like. So just another thing to keep in mind to help states navigate this transition. And so my colleague Jess in a few minutes will talk about the legislative trends that we'll see, but generally the takeaway has been that not all states have taken this advice to hold tight for right now, and we're seeing some rush to put legislation in, both around data but also around assessments and accountability, which of course has huge implications for data, that might have to change or might not be the wisest moves at this point. And that's something Jess will talk about a little bit later.
Great, thanks, Claire. And we at DQC are inclined to agree. We don't want to see state policymakers boxing themselves in. And you can imagine one accountability system in 2016 and another in 2017. What a moving target that gives to your schools and districts. But regardless, when you look at Claire's timeline, while we're waiting on Ed to say what we're supposed to do, and while we're waiting on the states to figure out what they want to do, there's legislative sessions happening at that time. So these are opportunities to have really productive conversations and make sure that we're not boxing ourselves in with, for instance, a really prohibitive privacy policy that could make some of the exciting things about ESSA impossible. So with that, I do want to turn a little bit to privacy. Like I said, we've seen tremendous momentum in states to create a state policy agenda through legislation around privacy over the past 2 to 3 years. And while the trend is slowing, 75 bills out there in more than half of the states is not small potatoes. I think some of the good news is that, by and large, the bills that we've seen this year have been really productive. They're based on productive conversations about making sure that data use is possible and that those data are really secure. And one key theme around that we think is a best practice is focusing on governance. So for that state data, making sure that that having a body who's accountable for making sure that information is shared appropriately, that there are privacy policies at the state and the district level in place, we think that's really productive. There was that started that model with Oklahoma, I believe, in 2014, and the state of Georgia passed just last year another really nice example of that bill. And an interesting thing that Georgia has done that we're starting to see other states consider and take up was they added into their state data governance bill a bill based on what's called SOPIPA. And of course, now that I'm on the spot, I can't remember what the acronym stands for. But it was a bill that was started in California and that we're seeing a lot of states take up. I'm hoping Brenda can remember when I turn to her in a second. They're seeing a lot of states take up this approach that focuses more on thinking about what vendors do. So if you're using apps in the classroom and technology in the classroom, sometimes those people have student information and what's their responsibility to protect and keep that information safe. Just a couple of examples, California, which is where SOPIPA really got started, are endeavoring to expand on that law this year by including early education operators under the definition of who's regulated by that bill. And in Illinois as well, they have created SOPIPA with a focus on higher education. So you're seeing people really think across the education pipeline, understanding that there's responsibilities outside of K-12 to think about the role of those vendors and those service providers who do have information. And meanwhile, though, while we're looking at this model that seems to be a pretty good model and that several states are taking on, we haven't really started to see it implemented yet. And we know that that's going to raise questions and issues going forward as we start to see that play out. So I actually want to turn to Brenda, and I'd love to have you talk a little bit about what are some of the things that are laid out in SOPIPA and SOPIPA-like bills across states. What happens, and what are some of the things that we should be looking for as states go to implement laws based on this model?
Great. Thanks, Brennan. Thanks to DQC for setting this up on such an important topic and very timely topic. Obviously, a lot of activity over the last couple of years on this. Am I still okay there, or do I need to restart? Okay. the Student Online Personal Information Protection Act, which is SOPIPA's full name, and actually makes a little bit of sense, didn't even mangle the English language too bad in coming up with that acronym, is designed, as you said, to start to target some of the responsibility for student data privacy on vendors, because in the last however many years, vendors are a more and more important partner in the use of technology, and therefore holding more and more student data in their role in working with schools for providing educational services. So existing law, federal law, is primarily puts the burden on schools to manage that data. And so now these laws that we've seen either proposed and passed over the last couple of years are to bring vendors into that. And as you said, SOPIPA is the first very comprehensive statewide bill that was passed and the first one to go into effect. It was in effect on January 1st of this year. So the overall goals of SOPIPA are very consistent with the goals of FERPA and other existing laws that govern schools, which is to prevent unauthorized disclosure of student information, to protect students from targeted advertising, which is a little bit of a newer aspect in more recent years because of the vendor relationship, to ensure good security, which is always critical when we're talking about student data. And one of the most important things maybe about this one is it provides deletion requirements for students upon student information, upon request by the school when the educational purpose is completed. So those are sort of the key goals of it, and it operates on vendors, as I said. So some of the things to look out for, be concerned about, or that may be changed after this law passed and other states based their laws on it. There are about 11 other states that passed laws that were very similar to SOPIPA, and 40-something that considered laws that were very similar in this wording. But one of the key things that SOPIPA doesn't do is allow additional disclosure by parents for other purposes. And we saw that corrected in other language, and that's something that we think is something to keep an eye on as SOPIPA is implemented. One thing SOPIPA does do, which is different from the federal level, is allows a private right of action. So parents might feel a greater sense of control in this law because they actually have the ability to take an action if they feel like there's been a problem with the school or that the school is not responsive regarding their child's data. So those are some of the key points, but there's a lot that remains to be seen as this law gets implemented in exactly how covered information is defined. It always sounds very clear in the definition that is provided, but then when you get into really specific types of vendor relationships with schools and those different business models, because remember, this covers K-12 information, so you don't just have math programs and reading programs, but you have learning management systems that schools use, you have the programs that students may be using to try to locate colleges and universities that they want to attend, or financial aid programs or scholarship opportunities, and it gets very complex when you actually get down into the details of that.
Yeah, I think that it's really complex note is a really important one to strike, that as we think about student data, and particularly as it relates to many other education policy initiatives that we may want to pursue, there's not simple fixes, and some of the efforts that we may have seen in the past and in some bills this year to just not collect things or prohibit certain types of information or defund data systems maybe don't actually do the nuanced and sometimes complicated work of protecting student privacy, but rather just scale back the access to information that we can use as a tool for education. So you point out an important point that even though this is an important step in SOPIPA, that there's still much to consider as we move to implementation. So to that point though, Brenda, I'd love to hear you talk just a little bit about that. As states maybe continue to innovate on this bill or think about the next steps, what are some of the things that you'd like to see them do?
So one of the things that SOPIPA does that is good is that it provides parents or students the opportunity to download their information that's in their education record being held by the school or by the vendor at that time. And there are some of the follow-up laws that didn't include that. So we think that's a really important one to be following. We would really like to see language that goes even a step beyond that and says that parents can authorize that disclosure by a vendor for some other purpose. For example, if parents have tutoring programs or out-of-school activities that they want the opportunity to make a connection to that data and maybe maintain a relationship with that account or vendor once the educational purpose is ended, that they should have the authority to do that. Did you want me to talk a little bit about the ACLU bill at this point and some comparisons, or?
That'd be great. Before you move on to that, though, I'd love to just, to your point that you're just making about parents having control and access over some of the other people in their kids' lives who they may need to see their information. I wanted to plug the work that our friends at Excel and Ed have done actually about Student Data Backpack, which touches on some of those ideas. So check that out on their website as well. But yes, so go ahead, Brenda. Talk about that as another model that's out there. I'd love to hear you just speak to that a little bit.
Great. Yes. No. We are big proponents of the concept of the digital backpack as well. And all I was really going to say right at that point, at least, is that the ACLU's model bills, which some version of the model bill was proposed in 16 states in January, and the District of Columbia, included that opportunity for parents to have that authority to further disclose their child's information, which we just think is a really key component. Another aspect that sometimes gets restricted is, in our opinion, too narrowly, is the opportunity to do research with the data. So the data can be aggregated or de-identified to various levels for various purposes, but the ability to use, I'm sorry if there's background noise, apparently we have a truck going by right now, the ability to use that data to really gain insight into the patterns and outcomes of existing practices and programs, especially when things are changing so fast, when there is so much new data and technology and new programs, new hardware being implemented in schools, the need to assess the effectiveness of that really just can't be overemphasized. And so we, again, very strongly believe that with the appropriate privacy protections, which is, it can't go without saying because our whole role in life is to say it, but that is the backdrop, but that those research and analysis must continue to give us the best insight, because otherwise we're not really gaining the full benefit of all of these new technologies, whether it's hardware or software or teaching styles or personalized learning or flipped classrooms or online testing versus hard copy testing, whatever the case may be. We have to understand what works and what doesn't, and get the best value out of all of that. And so these laws are important because they make the vendor a responsible party with the schools, but at the end of the day, that needs to be our focus, is what is going to ensure the best outcomes for students, which means protecting their data, but not at the expense of benefiting from that data. And I don't mean that it's a trade-off where you sell one for the other, but that we really believe you can do both. You can responsibly collect it and use it and protect it, and use it so that the student is getting the full benefit of it.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah, thank you for stressing that point. And you actually teed me up perfectly when you're talking about parents and being able to decide who some of the other parties are that might be able to see their students' information in order to support their education. We've seen certainly a trend towards that in legislation, particularly this year, where legislators we think are really making it's a good faith attempt to empower parents, but that sometimes the language that they're writing skews a little bit more towards making parents the watchdog of their students' privacy. So while we want parents to have information about the value of the information of data to their students' learning, who has access to it and why, having to overly monitor and be sure that privacy is protected, we think might be pushing into burden. And so one example of this is a bill in my home state of Tennessee that would require the local education agency, so the school district or charter, to notify a student's parents by email every time someone accesses that student's data. So you can imagine that in a school where they're using great technology and the teachers rather are really using information to collaborate and help kids, that a parent's inbox could be pretty full. And while it might be someone within the school, like a data coach who should be working with and supporting that student through their data, that it could be alarming to parents to have this flood of stuff in their inbox about accessing information. So again, while the intention there is right, the idea that parents should understand who's using their kids' data and why, that some of this might be going a little too far. So Brenda, I'd like to turn to you all again. I know you all have done some research thinking about when it's appropriate to opt in versus opt out and what really good informed consent around data collection look like. Can you talk about what is appropriate action for parents to take that policymakers should be considering as they're writing these kinds of bills?
Sure, absolutely. As you said, we have engaged on this question of opt-in versus opt-out of data collection in many times over the last year or so in all of these legislative conversations. And the general sort of short answer is that the education technologies that are being used in school for the primary purposes of the educational process are not opt-in or opt-out. You don't ask a parent to opt in or opt out of a particular textbook or of gym class or of any other intrinsic part of the educational day. And so if a system has been evaluated by the school system, and that includes the community, the Board of Supervisors or the school board and the parent involvement and the PTA and everything else, but once it's been selected and incorporated into the educational process, then it is appropriate for all students to be doing that. And while there should absolutely be full disclosure and transparency of who the school's partners are, what vendors they are using, what products, and that should include what data is being gathered as part of that process, that's not an opt-in or opt-out situation. Where there are plenty of opportunities for schools to give opportunities to parents to make those choices is in all of the things that schools do that are not intrinsically part of the primary role of education. So whether it's extracurricular activities or band or sports teams or whatever other parts of the school might be involved, if they want to have parents opt in and opt out to various different degrees, that is entirely appropriate, and again, entirely based on the community to decide, the parents and the schools together. Sorry, what was the second part that you asked me after opt-in and opt-out was, transparency to the parents for how the data is being used. So we agree, absolutely. There's a fine line, or maybe a really broad line, between too much information and putting too much responsibility on the parent side and being transparent to the parents. So again, to emphasize that a parent, even in FERPA, as it exists today, has the right to access all the parts of their student's education record. So a school should make that easy. It should make it clear to a parent who to talk to or how to request that information. Schools already are under the requirement to provide what they consider directory information at the beginning of every year, which is what it sounds like. Directory information is usually name, address, phone number, maybe email address, maybe some other basic information, the grade level the student is in, things like that. And give the parents the right to opt out of that so that their information isn't being shared even in programs printed by the schools, or maybe they don't want their child's picture on school materials or social media or something like that. They can opt out of those portions of that. But to put too much emphasis on providing information to the parents starts to make the parents feel like they're the one needing to look at everything that is being done, and that isn't their responsibility. That's the school's responsibility as part of that core educational process to have the teacher look at the data, have the teacher share it with the principal. If the principal needs to share it with a teacher of a specialty service or a guidance counselor, or even if it's health data from the nurse that the principal needs to be aware of, then they reach out to the parents when it's appropriate. There's a lot of schools that now have student information systems where parents have a portal that they can sign on and access their students' data, and that's a great way for parents to be able to see on a regular basis a lot of information. Even on that, though, we get some parents telling us that it's almost too much, that they get an email with their child's grades on every assignment that week, and then they have this portal, they can look and see what they had for lunch that day, and at times it feels to them like that's trying to sort of pull them into the process beyond the level where they start to wonder, what am I supposed to be doing with all of this? So every school, every community, different parents, of course, have different preferences on that. And it's probably not ever going to be a perfect one-size-fits-all, but somewhere in there is the right balance for making sure parents are aware of what's happening and have the knowledge to impact it when and where they can and should want to, but also not overwhelm them to the point where they feel like it's all being put on them to make choices about their child's data.
Thank you for that. Really great answers all. And there's one point that you made early in your answer that I really wanted to stress is that schools often don't, and certainly shouldn't, and I think this is true for states as well, make decisions in a vacuum. That the best way to determine what's best for kids is often through stakeholder engagement and involving a broader audience in the conversation. going back to ESSA, that's something that's required of states in their plans, is to engage with stakeholders more broadly, to not just sit in a closed room. And the same is true for conversations about data, that you want to make sure that people understand and are bought in to the how and the why of using this information without going too far afield and to help us with every single decision in a burdensome way along the way. Before we move on to the next part of the agenda, we do have a pretty interesting question from a viewer, and I'd like to ask my friends at ExcelinEd as well as Brenda to weigh in on this. Opt-in and opt-out has been a pretty big conversation that's been happening in education over the past few years. And so Glenn asked, how is opt-in and opt-out of data collection different from opt-in and opt-out of state assessment? And I think there are some policy implications there, but I think we could agree that some of the same concerns about kids play into those decisions. But I'd love to hear from you all about what some of the differences in your mind may be.
Well, I mean, I think there's certainly some overlap. I think the concerns are similar, and I think there's certainly some overlap, because if you opt out of testing, you're also opting out of the data that would come from that testing. But then, to me, then opting out of data is that additional step that Brenda can cover of then what is done with that data, and does that data just stay with the parent or the teacher, or where does that a parent can then opt out of that data going a certain place, going up to the state or the feds, those kinds of concerns. I mean, I'd love Brenda to touch on what are the most common kind of data opt-out bills, and then we can talk a little bit about what it's looking like legislatively on the opt-out of assessments, if you'd like.
So sure, I'd be happy to. And this is, I hope that I don't end up sounding too lawyerly here, trying to split a couple of hairs, but there are differences in why people opt out of different things. And what we're trying to say, so what we're trying to do is focus on the privacy requirements or good privacy practices for the data that's collected by a school in its educational function. And that should not, in our opinion, should not be part of either a shield or a sword in the bigger discussion of educational reform. So the question of whether you think kids are tested too much or not enough is a very valid question that, again, should be taken up in a number of different forums or contexts and has a lot of different opinions on how it should be answered. But let's at least sort of acknowledge that there's probably at some point going to be some testing. So whatever amount of testing it is and however it is applied, that means there's data at the end. And our focus is on making sure that that data is managed, collected, and used responsibly. We even, in a paper that we wrote about it, said that if parents opt out of testing as a way of protesting the amount or type or level of testing, that's entirely their right to do. Now, we might disagree that it's the most effective tactic, but that's a different reason for opting out than because you have a privacy concern or a security concern, or even ultimately an evaluation concern about either your child or the school or the teacher or the district or however that type of testing data is being applied. So again, I don't want to sound like I'm trying to split that, but we really do feel that there's a distinct difference in a family that wants to opt out of their child being in an account on a Chromebook or a particular account or program at the school because of privacy concerns, because they don't want their child active online in a way that the other children in that class are going to be. That's a concern for us because we feel that that's not the appropriate sort of opt-out, again, if that school and community have made the decision that that's going to be the way the educational process occurs there, is different than we want less standardized testing, and so we're going to protest that. At the end of the day, whatever testing occurs is going to have scores and results, and we want to make sure that those are handled appropriately. So did that answer your question? Or
Yes, and I would add, we advocate as well for fewer, better tests. We believe in the value of measurement, and what gets measured gets done, and the data that we get from these good, fewer assessments is so valuable in figuring out where students are, where they are in comparison to their peers, providing teachers with data that can help the student improve, really just focusing on student achievement. And so I understand the point about taking a student out of a testing situation because of over-testing, but then you don't have that important data to make sure that that child is moving on, is ready to move on, is ready for college and career, providing the teacher with that information that's so crucial to assist that student. And then I would just add as well one thing as we talk more about ESSA and throughout this implementation process, and Claire showed that timeline, which I think is fantastic, and it shows that we are at the very beginning of a very long and important process. And the more that we dive into this process, it's very much a learning and a planning process. So getting a handle on what's actually in the bill will help us with policy decisions. But one thing I wanted to point out, because you see a lot of news articles talking about what the bill says about opting out. And ESSA does not permit opt-outs. So I think that you may have seen that argument, you may have heard that argument, the new federal bill allows opt-outs. It's not true. It doesn't permit opt-outs. It still requires that 95% of students, both for the whole school and in the individual subgroups, do take these tests. So there is that requirement. What it does is it allows that school to establish the penalty for that. So it's a state decision what the penalty for the opt-out, if it drops below that 95%, is. So it's still there. It's a state decision on how to handle it if it's an issue. But I do think that's an important clarifying point to make as we discuss the opt-out across the country.
Yeah, thanks to you both. And our question asker, Glenn, says, good distinction made, tough issue, which it is. And I just want to add one thing to what Brenda was saying, that, protecting privacy and then sort of protesting the amount of tests are slightly different things and slightly different reasons to opt out. But we're of the mind, and some of the parent opinion work that we've done demonstrates that the root of this is frequently the same, which is that parents haven't seen the value. They don't understand why the annual summative assessment is useful for their child and supports their learning, to the point that Jess makes, although we certainly believe that it does and it should, and that teachers and principals should be empowered and trained on how to use that information to support student learning going forward. And same thing when we're talking more about technology, is that if they don't fully understand the value, particularly if they have a sense that their student might be compromised in some way by using that tool or that piece of technology, that they're not going to buy into it. And so to circle back to my previous point about, we need to make sure that there's broader stakeholder engagement and buy-in, and not try to help parents from feeling like these decisions are being made on behalf of their kids in a locked room, but that actually the point of these decisions are to help them get value out of things that support their kids' learning. We'll all be in a much better place. And so thank you for Glenn for that ramble.
And Brent, I don't know if you want to move on from that, but I do think, since we're talking legislatively, I think there are we do testing is so important. That's the top line. But there is some there's plenty of over testing. There's plenty of low quality testing going on, and so we do think there are some legislative solutions, some of which are massive and innovative, of changing how we test in general. There's some of those opportunities under ESSA, and then there's some lower hanging fruit that address some of those issues about parents and their concerns. An example is, pass a state law that requires that an interim assessment in the school year, that the results are back to the teacher within 2 weeks, or whatever is reasonable in your state. Pass a bill that moves the testing window back as far as possible, so you maximize instructional time and don't have dead time. Pass a law that requires the test results from this year to go to the teacher of record of the next year. These things that are common sense, but aren't happening a lot of times, and so no wonder parents are frustrated, because this test is taken, and it takes a lot of time, and then it goes into the ether. We're not using the results well enough. And I do think there is something we're looking at a lot. We can talk about it some other time, of just some again, long-term solutions, but some really simple things we could do to make sure tests are serving their purpose more effectively.
I love the idea of that law or policy that requires the test to go courses for next year. I think that's a struggle for teachers as well, that they're not always sure why they're giving this annual summative assessment if they never see the information for their kids from that school year, but how powerful could it be for their planning to the following year? We need to make sure we're not hiding behind Ferber or passing state privacy laws that keep them from having that longitudinal, that background information about their kids. It's an interesting idea. Thank you, Claire. So this is we still have a lot more things to talk about. But if you do have questions in the audience, please go ahead and give them to the chat. But otherwise, we're going to keep plowing through because there's much more that's been happening in the states to discuss. And this concept of opt-in and opt-out brings us actually to a really nice segue about another somewhat new trend that we were seeing in state legislation this year, we are seeing in state legislation this year, around surveys of students and the types of questions that you can or cannot ask of kids. And in some instances saying that you cannot ask questions, non-academic questions of kids at all. In some instances saying that assessments, so for instance like PARCC or even NAEP, the Nation's Report Card, that have surveys associated with them cannot be administered. Really trying to shut down things that will give us some broader conversations about what's going on in kids' lives. There is a federal education law, not education law, a federal law, PPRA, that already says that assessments, that questions about sexual orientation or drug use or things like that are already opt-in. They already require permission. But we're seeing states trying to go a little further. I'd be interested to hear if my colleagues agree that, other than just boxing yourselves in and being really prohibitive on top of sort of a federal structure that already requires that we ask parents permission, that why would we want to get, especially given this conversation we just had about assessment, cut ourselves off from being able to have whole pictures of kids, setting aside the drug use kind of stuff, that where surveys can help support teacher improvement or understand some of the social emotional skills that kids may have, that we may not want to be shutting ourselves down by prohibiting surveys that can help educators get at that type of information. Any reaction from my colleagues on that?
So yeah, this is Brenda. We agree. The PPRA, as you said, already restricts or at least requires opt-in and disclosure on any federally sponsored surveys. And so the more that any other laws might restrict beyond that or just completely bar the use of surveys or any other kind of data collection or analysis that might be insightful into the role of these other factors in a student's life, we really think are a little misguided. We understand that people have concerns about what can be considered sensitive information, but this ties back to what I was saying before. In order to really get a full understanding of what works in the educational context, it's not always just about the academic data. The reason that we have school lunch programs now and school breakfast programs now is because at some point somebody had the sort of intuitive knowledge and also put some data behind it to back up the fact that a kid that eats breakfast does better in school, and children that are fed throughout the day are able to concentrate and get the benefit of school that they aren't otherwise. And I don't think anybody questions that now, but that was built on data that understood whether the child had enough money to buy lunch or bring lunch every day, and we've worked within that context for a long time. So a lot of things now are almost as obvious. Does the kid have internet access at home? Do they have devices, or do they have an ISP provider of any kind? And what are the opportunities they have to magnify what they learn during the school day, but by what happens to them at home before and after school? And that understanding can be really critical for a teacher or for the school system as a whole to provide the full benefit of the educational process. And so it might not be as clear right away why some of that information matters, and it absolutely needs to be collected thoughtfully and with the understanding of how it's going to be held and protected and not shared outside of the use for which it's needed or included. But it can be really, really valuable, and we have always, in those conversations, whether it's with policymakers or district leaders or state leaders, encourage them to take that sort of longer-term view of what choices they're making, and what we call the law of unintended consequences, where if they pass things that sound like really nice bright lines that are easily defendable, they actually may end up hurting themselves and their ability to provide the best opportunities to the most students.
Yeah, it's so evident how quickly the line, where we're here to talk about state legislation, but how quickly the line blurs into the need to really inform parents and policymakers about the value and the role of the things that we're doing in kids' schools, including surveys that may feel different and like, why are you doing this, but may actually really help them eat or learn better or feel safer, which are all really important roles. Thanks, Brenda. So I have a couple of more bills that I'd like to highlight, but I'm conscious of the time, so I want to actually turn to our friends at Excel and Ed to talk a little bit more with us about this new federal education law, ESSA, and how it intersects with state policies and the types of things that you would like to see states do or not do in the coming year. So some of the issues that you think they really need to tackle and how to go about that in a thoughtful way.
Yeah, absolutely. So again, kind of referring back to Claire's timeline, this shows that we're at the beginning. There are a lot of decisions to be made, but there's still a lot to be done and a lot to learn. So especially right now, I would stress the importance of a little bit of patience, looking to build your coalition, connecting with stakeholders, just kind of reflect on this. Okay, the federal government is wanting to give more power to the states. What do we want to do with that? Who do we want to be as a state? How do we want to define ourselves? So there's very much an optimism around the ability to make these decisions as a state, but obviously some great responsibility as well. At this point in the process, it's important to just be diving into the legislation, to be engaged as a state in the rulemaking process. There are opportunities as a state to go on the record, to provide your feedback, especially as these major decisions are being made that will affect your state. So there are definitely some opportunities there. So I would encourage folks to look for those, or to reach out to us or other groups who are engaged. We'd be glad to share those opportunities as they come. And then, no ESSA legislation this session is a good thing. We're too early in the process. We're going to begin that transition year, but we have time. Time is built in, and we should use that to our advantage and to not take steps down the direction of something that would not be in compliance with this new federal law. Again, just a lot of optimism right now, a lot of information in the bill. People have been focused on the accountability piece, and that is one major piece and one hot topic, but the bill is so much more than that. And there are a lot of new opportunities. There are federal funds to support state reforms around K-3 reading, around college and career readiness, around digital learning, talking about testing and the importance of fewer, better tests, of having tests that are impactful. With the Secretary can make grants available for audits for states, for state and district assessments. It's a great opportunity to take a look at what is actually going on in the state, to get an audit of actually what your state assessments look like. And then again, finding ways to get engaged, I think, is really important. Learning for yourself, relying on other state groups like ourselves and those on the phone who are using their manpower to dig through this 1,000+ page bill to really find out what's in there, what are the question marks, where are the lines drawn, so that you can start that planning process, I think is super important. We talked about the opt-out piece and what the bill actually says. There are some assessment pieces that we're seeing right now. The existing law as well as ESSA both require that states administer the same assessment across all elementary school students. There's some some exceptions allowed at the high school level, but below that it requires the same assessments, and we're seeing some legislation filed this year that would allow multi-assessments within a state that go against this ESSA policy, and actually what's on the books right now as well. So diving into it a little bit to see where's our current legislation out of compliance, and then using that knowledge to help establish where you want to be as a state, where the opportunities are, especially within the legislation. It's something that we're encouraging folks to do. There's a lot of information coming out as folks dig deeper. We're providing that as well. I think on the event page we put our summary of the bill, and even a summary of a 1,000-page bill is still like it needs its own summary, but it's there, divided by policy section to provide that information. Again, it's this planning process. There should be a sense of urgency, but also having some patience and focusing on the optimistic perspective of all the new opportunities there. It's what we're stressing to states, and we're working with states as they have questions or want to get engaged. But right now, it really is the beginning of a very long and very important process to let states define what they want their education system to look like and how they want their students to graduate.
Yeah, I think I'll just plug a couple of one just for those who care about really getting into the wonky weeds of some of the stuff. The negotiated rulemaking committee on the assessment pieces of ESSA has been announced, and there's some actually pretty good 2-pagers on the Department of Ed's website that highlight some of the questions and proposed regulations that they're going to be digging into. Included in this conversation is that locally selected, nationally recognized high school assessment that Jess just alluded to there. So the potential for high schools to be able to do something different than what the rest of the state's doing. I'm personally fascinated to see what Ed comes out with on that. And then one other thing I'll also plug, you heard Jess mention that our friends at Excellent Ed have some great resources on this, on ESSA and what the opportunities for state action and state policy are. DQC also has some. We did a webinar a couple of weeks back along Education Trust and Colorado Stand for Children that I encourage you to check out, and one just came through my inbox today from KnowledgeWorks, which are the opportunities to focus on personalized learning that I thought in ESSA that I thought was nice too. Point being, there's a lot out there, and I think universally we all agree that ESSA is an opportunity for states, and that it's also going to be hard work for states, and they need to be really thoughtful about that work, what that work is. I liked Claire's term breakneck. The feds are already going at breakneck speed. Let's not also go states at breakneck speed in parallel with them and end up with 50 or maybe worse, 75 or 15,000 versions on the truth on this law. So thank you for that. Are there other things that, just because you all cover a wide and great range of policy ideas, other things that you hope to see states doing in legislation, or other pieces of success, hopefully that tied to data, but maybe not, that you're seeing out there this session?
We're actually not. I mean, most of the opportunities, I think, again, will be around next session. Most of what we've seen this session, I'll kick it to Jess, who focuses on them in the most detail, but is around assessments. And unfortunately, from our perspective, the backlash against assessments is continuing, and not in the most thoughtful way, not in a let's audit our assessments and eliminate the repetitive ones, but in sort of a brute backlash against them that we don't think is that thoughtful. If you want to talk about a couple of the examples.
Yeah, absolutely. I think what we're seeing this session are bills that are coming that we're then, as the education community, looking and saying, how does this work with ESSA? Does this work with ESSA? And starting to look at it from that perspective. We talked about the assessment piece, and we've seen a few assessment bills. Florida had a bill that failed this year that would have allowed multiple test options in lower grades, which would have been in violation of the new federal law, and also what's on the books now. Arizona passed a multi-state assessment. The way that their bill works is that districts and charters are allowed to use an alternative assessment for high school students in the 2017-18 year, and then the following year is when it kicks down to lower levels. So Arizona is going to need to have some compliance discussions. It sounds like some of those discussions are happening right now informally, but trying to figure out if there's a way to crosswalk that over to what would be compliant with ESSA. Georgia has a bill, a similar bill that includes some multi-testing language, and they've added some bill language that says if permitted under federal law. So adding that caveat into it will then lead to some further discussions as well. And I would anticipate that we would see more like that as states move forward, where there might be a question mark there. They're trying to stay on the right side, but especially while the rulemaking process continues, to kind of put that caveat there that if this is allowed under the new federal law, this is the direction we would go. And we talked about accountability a little bit, but the accountability system structure has new rules under ESSA, and so I think we're going to see a lot of legislation and a lot of discussion around that. Connecticut just released their new accountability system, and I've seen a lot of discussion on that. Does it or does it not comply? And they believe that it does, or as we go through the rulemaking process, they may need to make some slight changes. But as states make decisions on the front end that we're expecting most states to make decisions on in the coming years, I think that's what we'll be doing a lot of, is doing those crosswalks. What have you done? How does that line up with ESSA? And especially when it comes to assessments and accountability, we have our eyes out. I know that you all do as well, stakeholders across the country, just keeping an eye on legislation to make sure that what's coming does not impact our ability to measure what kids are learning. So if anything that takes a step back from that, anytime the assessments or the accountability system is weakened or inaccurate, then we're not getting accurate data, and that's really going to hinder our ability to make sure that kids are graduating college and career ready, that kids are ready to move on to the next grade. So that's, I guess, my hard note of caution when people are considering the change in policies that are either required under ESSA or the new opportunities that are available, of which there are some great opportunities, is to really make student achievement that center focus, and to really make sure that you're allowing the necessary collection and processing of data that will allow us to make those decisions, and again, keep student achievement center in all of the decisions that we're making.
Right, and helping parents understand as they make decisions on behalf of their students what to make sense of that information, particularly if it's not, one test across the state anymore. Much to consider. We, I think, could probably talk for another half an hour. I'm not going to do that. I want to thank all of you for joining me, both my colleagues here and the people joining online and on Twitter. Please reach out to us if you have more specific questions. There are other pieces of legislation that I'd like to talk to. I think I'm going to commit to writing a blog on behalf of DQC to talk about some of the other trends that we're seeing. Again, thank you all so much, and happy St. Patrick's Day.
Thanks very much.